So HDR is high dynamic range, and it's extending capabilities of TV and cinema. I'm mostly going to talk about the TV side, but almost everything I say is applicable to cinema, but in a much reduced scale, because with 40, 50-foot screens, you can't really get very bright in cinema. But you can get some HDR effects there, and that's being worked on too. But anyway, one of the things that happens with engineering is that you start putting tags on concepts, and they're always acronyms. 3 letters are obviously good, 4 letters are okay. And so we're going to have a lot of them, and hopefully somewhere through the course of my talk you'll get some idea of what all of these acronyms are. To start out though, I am really officially a member of the IHA, the I Hate Acronyms Club, but it's the best you can do is to get these concepts nailed down. And a lot of them overlap each other, and you're talking about all the different dimensions of how images can be improved. And there's many axes along which you can make the numbers better. So let's go through some of those just to start, sort of get a grounding on some of the things that people have been talking about. And it's all over the press, and it's been since NAB and CES this year was the first real demos. So there's a lot of activity around HDR to begin with. So what is it? There's a scale here in log space, which is roughly equivalent to what the eye can see, that goes from probably the blackest that displays can currently do if they're not completely turned off, which is somewhere about 0.0001 nits on the left, and 10,000 nits on the right is a number that is common in sort of the Dolby PQ encoding as a target they tested. They actually tested 20,000 nits, but 10,000 was where they wound up. And so in a traditional video environment, our ranges are in displays in the CRT era, we're about a 20,000 to 1 dynamic range from white to black, with white being around 100 nits, or a 2 on the scale there. And it would go down to whatever the flare and phosphor level of the CRT was. Now in the LCD world, we lost a lot of dynamic range. Initially, LCDs were only getting us 1,000 to 1. They've gradually now gotten better with different backlight controls to get maybe 4,000 to 1, which is a quite respectable black and sort of looks okay. So I've indicated on the chart for SDR, as we're using the acronym now for standard dynamic range, that the areas in yellow are areas in which we have variance performance in our display systems. So in video, it's common to take displays now up to 400 or 500 nits, and the black levels vary as well. OLEDs go down quite substantially. And so that scale floats around a little bit, and it's somewhat relative. So we're still taking a standard video signal, a 0 to 1, putting it into the video devices, and it sort of shows up wherever that display can show it to its best advantage. HDR has several different approaches that are being looked at now, because all this is new and the best way to do it is still being figured out. And it's hard to even agree on what an HDR range is. I think the most important thing that people realize is that you want several stops, meaning doubling of light, above your reference white to give increased detail and highlights, because that seems to be the single biggest impactful improvement to an image. And that's even comparing across things like wide color and high frame rate. People look at images that have a punch to the highlights with more detail, whether that's 2, 3, or 4 stops, and they all say that is more realistic. That to me looks more like real life. So where that's going to fall out and what ranges we're going to wind up with is going to be an exploration of the manufacturers as they deploy new technologies in the next couple of years. We're hoping it's somewhere at least 10,000 to 1, because if you're buying a set that is 1,000 to 1 and they label it as HDR, they're just doing that marketing thing of not telling you the truth. So you definitely want better performance. You want to have increased range. And there are potentials that are seen in several systems now where they're showing 2,000 nit whites, but only for a very small part of the frame. And that means that there's a problem in how much highlight you can actually afford to show. There's now a highlight budget because you can't turn the whole screen white at 2,000 nits. It takes too much power, generates too much heat. So a small area, 1% or 10%, can go at a certain brightness. So you're going to find in HDR that everybody is exploring what it means to show highlights in a better form, but they're now manipulating the signal a lot more than they were in traditional video. So that is the really basic concept of HDR. Exploring more highlight detail. If we ever get better black performance, the same thing can be said about blacks. But right now, it's more about if you can see your shadow detail at black, everybody's happy, and there's not a lot of range that is available to play with down there. So this is a snapshot of an HDR display. Actually, I photographed a Dolby PRM 4200, and that's on the right. On the left is a 100 nit reference monitor. On the right is a 600 nit HDR display. So although it's not great because lots of things wrong with this projector. In fact, can we get the lights down a little bit somehow? I don't know if you've got a control there or not. But anyway, you can see what's happening to the light, the windows. You know, we're getting more contrast. It's pushing the brightness of those areas of the frame. And if you see it in person, you definitely get a much more impactful feeling that's more realistic. Another thing that we talk a lot about is how do we get material into HDR? And this is a reminder slide of the eye and the real world have a much greater dynamic range than any of our displays have. So this is the same scene photographed at midnight and at noon. And it's a difference in dynamic range of about 768,000 to 1, where all that was changed was the exposure. I think the exposure on the left, which is the nighttime one, was a 1 minute long exposure. And yet, most of the detail is actually still visible in both of these. So, to the eye, this would, you know, it would be night with, you know, a faint moon and haze. But you can map this up and you could look at it on any devices. Or if you had the range, you could push it really dark and still see all of this detail because the eye could adapt and see that kind of detail. Now, there's an argument that goes on about how HDR's goal should be to recreate reality. As someone from the film community and content production, I don't actually agree with that, because what we're showing is stories. And stories, you don't want the brightness of the shots distracting you from what's actually going on in the shots. But that is one of the things that is happening in terms of finding a balance between what the filmmakers and content creators will want versus some of the technological capabilities. Another acronym being talked about is wide color gamut. This is a somewhat technical slide, but since most of that can't be read, I'll try to explain. It's the CIE locus, which is all the visible colors in UV, although it's labeled XY, it's actually UV, it's slightly rotated. The outside orange, which is this one, is the new Rec 2020 color space that's now been standardized at the ITU. It has color positions that are right on the spectral locus, right here. So that the only way you can make that color is with a laser of exactly that wavelength. If you have OLEDs or LCDs or something, you're going to be making a primary somewhere in here rather than there. You just can't get all the way out. So even though a lot of people are talking about supporting Rec 2020 as the new thing in sets, most of the sets can't make it. If they're good, most of them can get to here, because this is P3 and the magenta line, or Rec 709, and this is the green line. So digital cinema or standard video. And all the sets can get somewhere in that vicinity, or at least as a target. So how much wide color are we going to have is a debate and a question. And how much do we master for? How much can you see? What difference does it make? Is it important? All of these are sort of judgment calls. It certainly, and the only one I've seen so far, it made a huge difference for Pixar in their Inside Out, which they showed at the El Capitan in an extended wide color gamut. And it really sparkled. I mean, it just made some of the colors in the animated movie really jump out at you. In the real world, we don't get a lot of colors out there. This is from a paper that NHK did when they were setting up the Rec 2020 standard. And it shows they had to look really hard to find fluorescent, iridescent colors from flowers and butterflies, and they had 6 or 7 other examples. Most colors don't reach out to the edge. So there's a lot of normal surface colors that P3 covers just fine. However, I want to go back to this one for just a second. I want to notice there's a bunch of little dots floating around. Those are samples from Vision Premiere stock from Kodak. So that is the subtractive color gamut that film had. And one of the things you can notice is that P3, even though it's our cinema standard, it cuts off a lot of colors that were present in film that can't be achieved. But Rec 2020, with laser projectors in the cinema, could in fact bring a lot of those colors back. Not that we're going to get all of them, but it can enhance the colors in the cinema environment, especially in things like cyan and yellow and purples, which are difficult to achieve in digital cinema. So just as an example, this is actually scaled relative to Rec 709 just to show how much of a pop it is. But that's about the chroma difference between our standard television colors and Rec 2020. It's almost twice as chromatic, maybe 2.5 times as chromatic as Rec 709. Other things talked about in the television community right now are high frame rate. The Rec 2020 standard actually permits 120 frames per second. SMPTE's standards for the same UHD or ultra high definition television did not incorporate 120 frames because almost nobody agreed that the ecosystem was ready for it. When you start trying to deploy 120 across broadcasting and cable and all these other systems, they're just not enough bandwidth yet. And the compression technology is getting better, but may not be there to support that yet. But there is a push for that eventually, but that's going to be a Christmas present perhaps a decade from now. High precision is something that we're dealing with in, we already, as part of UHD and HDR, have to move systems to a real 10 bits. Blu-ray and DVDs, they've always been 8 bits. It was the right 8 bits, exactly the right 8 bits for 709, but HDR really demands a minimum of 10 bits, and was actually recommended that we use 12 bits in most of the ecosystem, but again, the weight of the infrastructure we currently have, which can always transmit 10, 12 was just a little bit too far. So some places can do it, cameras can do 16 bits, but getting it out to consumers or even out to some recordings, 10 bit is more or less the standard. But there's desires to push up in the scale in terms of precision because it maintains color quality. It will get rid of some of the banding that you can see in a lot of content, especially as things fade to black, they kind of degrade and fall apart. Precision is where that problem gets solved. Also high resolution. 4K or the 3840, 2160 UHD standard is already in sets. You can go to Fry's Electronics or Best Buy, and there's a dozen, quote, 4K sets on the wall. 8K is in active development because Japan has been working on that for about 10 years, and they're very serious about deploying 8K satellite transmission and displays for the 2020 Olympics. So they've already done tests in the London Olympics where they transmitted 8K back and forth, and they did a live broadcast in 8K of the opening ceremonies. So there's at least a dozen manufacturers who are looking at making 8K displays, and some of those are usually, they show up at NAB or CES as, premium $400,000 100-inch displays that are 8K. Although I did see one in the there's a research section where Japan shows some of their things that had a 20-inch 8K display where you couldn't see any pixels. It's just you need a magnifying glass. They're so small. I had hoped that 8K, in terms of, since I do a lot of post-production and camera production, I was hoping that 8K wouldn't show up in my lifetime before I retire, but that doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So what has SMPTE been doing so far? Some of you have read the journal, you'll already know some of these things, but the first thing that was published early in the year was SMPTE 2084, also known as Dolby PQ. It's a transfer function, one part of the equation for specifying an HDR signal, the other parts being the color primaries and the weight point, and the scaling, legal versus full range, et cetera. SMPTE 2086. So let me step back. So 2084 allows you to encode video in absolute luminance. So you can make a output that has a 1,000 nit white, or a 4,000 nit white, or a 10,000 nit white. And that signal, if done correctly, will properly display on any set that had that particular luminance. But obviously there can be a mismatch, because if you encode 4,000 nits, but your display can only show 800, what do? How do you transform that? You don't really usually have information in the signal that tells you what the creatives did to make that signal. So that's where 2086 came in. It's a mastering metadata that specifies what the white point the creators wanted to create was. If it was 1,000 nits, you put that in, and then the sets would know, oh, I only have to worry about up to 1,000. Even though I may be a 4,000 nit set, I don't have to do that. I don't have to push it to 4,000. I just put out 1,000. Or the other way around, if it's flipped, where they made a 4,000 nit master, but the set can only do 800, they then know they're going to have to transform what they get from that signal to make it work on their set. They can't just leave it alone. They're going to have to do something. So metadata is becoming important for this variable encoding that is possible for HDR. Part 3 is SMPTE 2094 is a ongoing drafting group that's still looking at metadata. And here the hint isn't about what the creative did with the mastering side, it's what does the content actually have in it? Like what is the brightness, color space, color primaries? Was it made in 709 or was it made in P3? Because then they can apply color mapping to take wide color and put it in narrow color, or manipulate the chroma of the image based on what the content is actually doing. So there's no general purpose, one size fits all circuit you can build that will take any color and produce any color as output without making some compromises. So the more hints you have in metadata, the less compromises you have to make. They can figure out what the well, not necessarily optimum, they can figure out a better way to show that image. And that's one of the things SMPTE's been working on. Number 4 is coming soon, is a study group report on the HDR ecosystem. It's looking at the impact of HDR across all of our technical and broadcast gear, and looking at what standards have to be modified or created. It's sort of trying to find all the loose ends of where HDR needs work. Despite all of that, and despite the fact that standards are a little behind, there's actually plenty of things already figured out in which products can be made and HDR systems can be sold. So you have the Ultra Blu-ray spec was finished this summer, and that means that at Christmas time this year, you're going to have Ultra Blu-ray players and packaged content on the shelves for people to buy. Obviously, going to be early adopters who want to get in first, but there will probably be a dozen or more titles at the end of November that you can get at Best Buy or such. Several of the internet companies, over to the top companies, have already announced support for HDR content. Amazon has a test page with 2 movies that were turned into HDR. Netflix, Vudu, MGO are all doing things. MGO is mostly working with Samsung. And all of the major distribution companies are looking at HDR as to, well, what do we do? Broadcast has been looking at what's the next generation of broadcast signals for some time now, And HDR kind of snuck up on them because they were mostly thinking, well, we need to support 4K. Standard UHD, 4K, that's all people were thinking about. And literally the freight train of high dynamic range came out of left field, and a lot of people are trying to catch up to realize, well, we got to do something with this. So satellite, DirecTV is also talking about supporting HDR downloads, 4K HDR. They're launching new satellites that have twice the number of transponders, so they're going to have more bandwidth, and they'll have coverage over continents, you know, in whichever places they want to deploy that first. And most importantly, all of this deployment is happening over our existing infrastructure, 10-bit. We're not building new cables, new wires. It's just, you know, following along with what's already been done to support 10-bit and 4K.